Hello and welcome to this, the latest in a series of special classics and ancient history podcasts from Blackwell Online. My name is George Miller, and I'm very pleased to say that my guest today is Alastair Blanshard, who teaches at the University of Sydney, but visited the Blackwell offices recently on a trip to Oxford. Alastair is interested in how the classical past has been taken up, reimagined, distorted and redeployed in later centuries, in fields as diverse as philosophy and the cinema. In his previous book, Hercules, A Heroic Life, he looked at how the myth of that demigod had been replayed and refashioned since Antiquity. In his latest book, he tackles a much bigger topic, sex. And again, he is interested in tracing the uses and abuses for which the classical past has been pressed into service. Everything from so-called Greek love to the Roman orgy, which, as you're about to hear, is a vast fantasy built on very flimsy foundations. This interview is in two parts. Alastair's book sets Rome before Greece, as it has so coloured our views of ancient sex, and this interview does likewise. I began by remarking, though, that an injunction sought by Greek lawyers in 2004 against Oliver Stone's film Alexander for allegedly portraying the eponymous hero as gay suggested that ancient sexuality remained of much more than purely academic interest.
Yes, it's strange. Just when you think the world's forgotten the Greeks and Romans, suddenly they come back into focus. It's one of the things that really struck me when I was compiling the material for this book, is that there's no moment, no age where the sex lives of the Romans ever gets forgotten. There's no moment where we just don't think it's worthy of discussion or repetition or exploration. And that constant turn to Greece and Rome was what really kind of drove me in compiling the book and putting it together.
A lot of the terms that we bandy about today, like sexuality and homosexuality and heterosexuality, of course, were not terms that the Greeks and the Romans themselves would have used. But I thought your book was very robust in not getting bogged down in ways in which it could have got bogged down with methodological and definitional problems.
The issue of sexuality has been one that's experienced a huge kind of theoretical investigation in the last few decades. And in some ways, what I wanted to do in this book was something different, which is not so much to think about the actuality of sexuality and what was happening at any times, but rather just to compile stories and, as it were, to understand sexuality as a kind of storytelling. By doing that, I think what you can do is you can put aside issues of methodology and theoretical concerns about the actuality and instead focus on the narrative. And I think it's that because that narrative has important implications in its own right. And I think focusing on the narrative allows you to avoid the focus on the methodology and the sexuality, I think.
At one stage you say, in order to have a sex life, you by necessity have to have a life, which sounds like a banal statement, but in fact it's making a more important point about the incorporation of sexuality into life and to biography.
Yes, I think it's really important that fantasies require props, they require dressing, they require mise en scène. So I think that's one of the issues that often discussions of sexuality miss, is the rich aesthetics that has to attend any aspect of sex fantasy. And I'm very interested in how we dress up our fantasies and what we turn to when we want to imagine desire and pleasure, and just how constructed those turns are. That when you think what do I desire, what do I love, well, that love actually comes as a pre-wrapped package for you, and I think what I want to do is just show you how that package is put together.
To borrow your dressing up metaphor, and classical antiquity really is the biggest dressing up cupboard for the Western imagination, isn't it, when it comes to sex?
Yes. The book opens with a scene from the aftermath of the 9/11 catastrophe, and I was struck by this what became known as the phenomenon of terror sex. That is, people struck by the kind of apocalyptic visions that confronted them, just seeking kind of pleasure and transitory sex. But in doing so, where do they turn? Well, they turn to Rome. And it's almost this kind of reflex action that that when you're kind of stripped bare, what's your gut place to turn? Your place to turn is to turn to Rome. And I think that really spoke really strongly to me about kind of the West and the nature of our sexual desires.
So where do you see the first signs of this sort of construction, this later construction of Roman sexuality in the Western imagination?
I think it's an ongoing process. I think from the moment that the Romans capture Greece onwards, there's been a construction of desire and a repackaging of desire. I mean, there are kind of key moments one can turn to. I think that the Renaissance, for example, has got to be a key moment in the story of the reawakening of sexual desire, and the way in which a whole discovery of new pleasures come in the rediscovery of Greece and Rome, of which sexual pleasure is one, and that's I think crucial. The Enlightenment, likewise, when it theoretically turns to reason, it does so, but it does so never holding on to a kind of vision of the classical past for which it feels deep affection, and so yes, we keep doing it. I mean, that's the extraordinary thing.
And at one point in the book, I think in the context of writing about film, you say that sexy Rome both horrifies and tantalizes, and that seemed to me to nicely encapsulate our ambivalence of our attitude to Roman sexuality. Can you unpack that a little bit?
Yes, I mean that's really, I think, part of why Rome and this vision of Rome has been so successful, is that it appeals both to moralists who want to feel a sense of outrage, and also to libertines looking for some kind of fantasy, and both groups, rather bizarrely, who would agree on nothing else, can nevertheless construct a vision of Rome to which they're both happy to sign up. That is to say, the pagan, decadent, oversexed, lush vision of Rome. And it's really strange. It's almost like a pincer movement. And, the ancient world gets captured by. Both these groups really want to perpetuate and have a vested interest in perpetuating this vision of the ancient world.
I mean, would you go as far as to say that Christianity really needs this narrative of Roman decadence and sensuality and sexuality in order to sort of sustain its own narrative?
Yes, I mean, what's I think interesting about Christianity is that it practices strategies that are in fact used by all sorts of religious groups in the ancient world. The body and the regulation of bodily desires and appetites is in fact a strategy that's used by Pythagoreans. It's used by the followers of Mithras. That every time a new religious cult comes onto the scene, the body becomes the place at which decides to distinguish itself from the world around it. So Christianity is actually walking a pretty well-worn path when it expresses notions of chastity, self-control, and desire. It's a way of marking yourself out, and a way that comes with a kind of tradition when Christianity starts it.
So when a visitor goes to Pompeii today and sees images of fallacies and looks at erotic frescoes and tries to count the number of brothels in the city, I mean, how much of a misreading are we projecting onto that ancient Roman town, just to sort of focus it on one example?
Well, of course, I mean, Pompeii is not just one example, it's the example. I mean, Pompeii dominates our vision of Rome in all sorts of ways. It's the way it, fills our history paintings, it fills our films. And, this small, provincial town on the Bay of Naples has become Rome for us in some ways. Likewise, it becomes invested with the same sexual charge to which we allocate all Roman culture. So all those phalluses, which are, as much symbols of fertility, of good luck, of ideas of abundance, as they are, with a kind of charge of eroticism, get misread. And of course, there's a huge industry to assist you in misreading. I mean, anyone who's been to Pompeii will know that this famous myth that the phalluses are designed to point the way to the brothels. I mean, and what was interesting in doing my research was just how early this myth goes. Almost from the moment the place is excavated, people are telling you this story. There's this tradition within the kind of tourism industry of promoting this and always taking you to see the brothel. And indeed, this desire to find brothels often means that buildings get misidentified as brothels because we want to see the brothel. I mean, brothels and latrines seem to be the things that people want to see. And I guess it's partly about trying to sort of feel a kind of moment of connection with the Romans, as well as having your preconceptions satisfied.